joining us at Dovecot Studios in Edinburgh for Holyrood Sources Live, Growing Scotland's Economy. This is the only debate in the run-up to the general election that is focusing purely on Scotland's economy, and we're very glad that you are here. We're proud to be here. We're proud to be doing this event, so thank you so much for joining us in Edinburgh. How many of you have been to a Holyrood Sources Live event before by way of making some noise so people can hear you? There's some hands going up. Hands going up are not noisy. I would just like to get you in the mood for what you're doing here. If it is your first time, you're very welcome. We do these every so often. Basically, when Geoff and Andy are getting itchy and need some sort of public adoration, we bring people together. If you're listening for the first time as well to the podcast as it's recorded, then I don't think I can say it better than Robbie77 on Apple Podcasts, who says, "The weekly listen for the best informed take on politics." And Calum, Andy, and Geoff all seem to like each other too, which is fun.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Like each other or not, we're all here. We're very glad to be here. And the people I'm referencing behind me are Geoff Aberdein, former Chief of Staff to Alex Salmond when he was First Minister. And also Andy Maciver, former Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Good, and so tonight, with our delivery partners, Scottish Financial Enterprise, and in association with EY, we are focusing on growing Scotland's economy. Now, around half of people say that they see the economy as one of the key factors in deciding how they're going to vote on the general election on July the 4th. A couple of thoughts before we get stuck in, boys, this evening. Geoff, let's start with you. I mean, this is a general election campaign. We've got the main Scottish parties represented this evening. We'll introduce them in a few minutes. We'll hear from the others over the course of this campaign. Fear not, the Scottish Greens, you will be invited on. We need to consider a bit about how kind of both parliaments should work together after the 4th of July. And I think part of that will kind of feed into lots of the conversations we're having tonight. I know for a start that you want to talk a lot about energy this evening. You'll all be surprised to know.
Well, this is fun. I'm going to be a weatherman very briefly for you all. You're going to put this up.
Yeah.
So I talk a lot about energy, and I've never seen a general election in my lifetime that has had energy at its focus for so long. Aberdein has been mentioned more than any other time in a general election. Energy security has been mentioned any other time than I can remember, and of course, indeed, that transition to net zero. So what I wanted to do was to put into pictures what I always say in words on the podcast to give people an understanding of the scale of the opportunity that we have before us in this country. So what we're looking at here very quickly is the green and the kind of turquoise blue are the ScotWind and Intog offshore wind licenses that have been awarded already. So all of these companies have invested in them significant amounts of money with a view to developing them in the not-too-distant future. This equates to over 30 gigawatts of power. I'm not an expert in this area, but 30 gigawatts is a hell of a lot. And to give you an indication, this is intended to unlock a minimum of £21 billion worth of investment in the supply chain. That's what they're committed to if we get the transition right. I'm going to be very quick here because I don't have much time, but I want to just point to these two blue, the dark blue here, are the two storage sites for Scotland's only carbon capture cluster at St Fergus, the Acorn project, a hugely ambitious project which has belatedly been approved to Track 2 status, and through its operation is anticipated to support 20,000 jobs minimum through its creation, and a few thousand thereafter in its operation. It's already harnessing different types of projects like direct air capture as well. That's the opportunity for us. That is the basis of the green industrialisation of our country. But I need to remind you, and I want to remind our politicians, and believe me, I will, that not 1 gram of steel of ScotWind or Intog is built yet in the North Sea. It's still going through consenting, planning, all those different types of considerations. We need a transition from A to B. And that needs to be managed carefully. And what it means in the meantime is that we need to have and support our oil and gas industry in the interim until that's available at scale. One stat just to leave you with before I finish, because I get really fed up with our politicians with the glib sound bites saying we need to invest in our renewables, we need to support our supply chain. Well, you support your supply chain by supporting the industry, and industry only manages to invest if it's making profits. Now this year, the ONS, that's not me, I know I've just got to stop, oil and gas production was its record low since 1948 in 2023. UK dependency on imports in that year increased to 41%. Now, of that 41%, because Norway's supporting a lot of continental Europe owing to the Russia crisis, we relied on LNG, liquid nitrogen gas from the US. It's 4 times more carbon heavy than anything that we produce domestically. Where is the sense in that? It's not beneficial to our environment, and it's certainly not beneficial to our economy. So I want to tease the politicians tonight on how we have a managed transition that protects and supports that industry, which is going to be so important in delivering those wonderful projects and getting us to net zero.
Well done. Geoff Aberdein there with a fascinating mix of Jeremy Vine and Michael Fish. Loved that. Right, Andy, a quick word from you then. Very quick.
Very quick.
This weekend, David Phillips, who is head of the Devolved and Local Government Finance at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, said Scotland was one of the most well-off regions in the UK, outperforming Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as the north of England and the Midlands, right? When it comes to economic growth, this is. He had on a per-person basis. Scotland's economy has been performing better than the rest of the UK since the pandemic. So what's still missing?
I think that is just symptomatic of one of the great political diseases of the post-devolution era, which is that we only ever compare ourselves to other nations in the UK. I would hope that we're performing better than the other nations in the UK, because they're not performing well either. The UK is behind even the poorly performing economies of the EU, miles behind the US and other nations that are comparable. So yeah, I would hope we're performing better, but that doesn't mean we're performing well. Our growth remains extremely poor. We have, we're sponsored here tonight by SFE and EY, right? We have world-class financial services here. I don't know if you know, we have got energy. There's some energy interest in Scotland as well. So, we should be doing well, much better than other nations of the UK. We may be doing slightly better in some areas, but we're certainly not doing anything like as well as we should. So, there's a few things that have perpetually annoyed me about Scottish politics, and one of them is that we always compare ourselves to other nations in the UK, particularly England, but it's not a very accurate comparison. We're not comparing ourselves to nations that we should be. So, I think we need to try to get over that tonight. It'd be good not to have any mentions of that. And I think the other thing that we really need to do is just have a much more mature debate, discussion about tax, about expenditure. Let's not pretend there aren't areas that can't be cut. I don't know why this word has become a swear word. It shouldn't be. It's a saving. There are plenty areas that we can do that in. Let's stop calling stuff free all the time. It is patronising and embarrassing. We don't have free tuition fees. We don't have a free NHS. We don't have free anything. So let's stop patronising people by using words that we're intelligent enough to know are wrong. Let's have a much more mature discussion.
Okay, lots of that to come then throughout the evening. Now, we are here thanks to EY and our delivery partners for this event, the special event, Scottish Financial Enterprise, the representative body for Scotland's financial services industry. So let's welcome, for a quick word, Sandy Begbie, the Chief Executive of SFE. Sandy, thanks so much. Thanks for putting this on with us. It's great to see you. It's a long walk down there, isn't it? Just a quick one, Sandy, because we're going to talk to you a bit later on for what we're describing as post-match analysis, once the politicians have gone and we can all say what we really think. Sandy, what are you hoping to hear from the politicians this evening? You've launched your manifesto ahead of this general election today. What do they need to do to impress you?
Well, a bit like Geoff said, in my lifetime, I've been going through endless amounts of general elections over the last 40 years, and for the first time I can ever recall, every party is talking about economic growth. But however, we need to face probably quite an inconvenient truth that our economic growth in the last 10 to 15 years, particularly post-economic crisis, has been pretty anemic. And I think Andy's point is well made, which is comparing ourselves with other parts of the UK won't really cut it. We need to think much more ambitious than that. So simply tweaking a few policies, introducing a few new policies, changing very little is not going to deliver what we're looking for, which is to really turbocharge our economic growth. And in our manifesto, we present what we think are some sensible suggestions, but also some more radical suggestions to really move the dial on economic growth.
Okay, nice. Sandy, we'll catch up a bit later on for a bit of post-match analysis. But yeah, thank you very much for now.
Thank you.
You can go and enjoy yourself. Cheers, Sandy Begbie. Okay, right, let's welcome then the politicians who are here to answer your questions, our questions, and to discuss growing Scotland's economy. I'll introduce all four of them. We can applaud all of them together as they all walk down the aisle. Will they be hand in hand? Who knows? Right, so joining us this evening we have Kate Forbes, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for the Economy and Gaelic. Murdo Fraser, Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Business, Economic Growth and Tourism from the Scottish Conservatives. I'm doing all four, Geoff. Michael Mara, the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Finance from Scottish Labour, and Willie Rennie, spokesperson for Education, Economy and Communities from the Liberal Democrats. Honestly, you can have four briefing calls ahead of these things, and it still goes wrong. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm sad to say that none of you held hands on the way down the aisle, but it's fine.
We did discuss it.
You did discuss it. Yeah. Well, we'll see if you hold hands on the way out. Right. Let's get stuck in then, shall we? It's really good to see you guys. Thank you very much. We'll take some questions from the audience throughout the evening. Lots of you have been submitting them throughout the day, for which we're very grateful. I think we want to start with tax. It's an important issue. And I think it's something that's just important for us to consider this evening. Higher earners in Scotland could face an additional £5,221 in taxes compared to if they were working elsewhere in the UK. Sorry to do the comparison, Andy. Potentially affecting around 154,000 individuals. This is analysis by EY. Kate, let's come to you first. Is the Scottish Government punishing high earners when it comes to tax?
So, no. And I think any discussion about tax that reduces it just to income tax is completely reductionist and defeatist. We have a broad debate right now in this election about taxation. And it reminds us that in Scotland we fixate on income tax, forgetting all the other taxes. The second thing is that you have to look at the data. Will come as no surprise to people in the audience, hopefully. I do not believe that you can continually raise tax. You just can't. Ultimately, if you care about guaranteeing public revenue, you have to be very careful when it comes to continually raising tax, and I don't think we should continue to raise tax. But the key for Scotland is the reference point with the rest of the UK. And, we've got the data from HMRC that suggests, I understand it doesn't apply to this budget year clearly because income tax you always deal with 18 months retrospectively. But when it comes to the data that HMRC has, they conclude that over 4,000 more people are coming to Scotland than leaving. And that's because I think people take decisions in the round. They look at their council tax, they look at non-domestic rates, they will look at perhaps national insurance, they look at everything in the round. And I think the big challenge in this election is that parties are not being honest with the electorate about how difficult our public finances are. They're making lots of promises about what they might do, and I don't think anybody is levelling with the public about what those difficult choices are. There's a lot of people, and I agree with this, that say the answer is economic growth. That is a very Liz Truss position to take, that just assuming economic growth will get us out of the current difficulties with our public finances. But if you look at the Institute for Fiscal Studies analysis, and actually most economists right now, they say that there's about £18 billion worth of cuts coming on public services. So clearly, Labour, and they can speak to this themselves, have suggestions for raising revenue for some of the new projects that they've got. But that doesn't answer how we're going to fund some of the challenges that are facing our core public services, like the NHS and so on.
Michael, that sounds like a challenge to you then, in terms of honesty from the parties ahead of this election. Can you sit here and say that you're being honest about tax with the electorate?
Yeah, I think we definitely can. And
well, hang on, can you or can't you? You think you definitely can?
I definitely can.
Fine.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And you would expect me to say that. I'll say a little bit why. I mean, I agree with certain parts of what Kate says in terms of, we have got the highest tax burden in the UK, across the UK, since the Second World War. We've become a very high-taxed part of Europe. We're risking secular stagnation in the economy across the board. And this is coming to the end of this Parliament is the first time in history that people will be poorer, households will be poorer than they were at the start of this Parliament. So it's an economic record across the UK that is frankly abysmal. We have to actually work into that with an idea and deal with the circumstances should Labour have the opportunity to serve in 3 weeks' time, to try and recognise that by saying that we're not going to make promises that we can't afford to keep. So I think all the commentary over the last kind of couple of days around Labour's manifesto has been, there was no rabbits to be pulled out the hat, there was no big surprises in there, and there wasn't, because frankly we can't afford many of those things. We'll have to wait and see what we inherit. So we have to be really clear on that. On the points around tax, we supported previous rises to the higher rates of tax, but there is a point at which that comes to a ceiling, and frankly I think we've already reached it. So if you see the costing for this year on the top rate, it was to increase, before behaviour effects, it was to around,
is that better? Okay, apologies. So across the, it was to the behaviour, before behaviour effects was to raise around £80 million. After behaviour effects, that was to be as low as £3 million to be generated. Frankly, I think it's going to be a negative impact. Because speaking to businesses across the board, and we'll find out, as Kate says, in 18 months' time. So we've already reached that ceiling and probably gone past it. So we have to be clear to people that we have to grow the economy if we're going to get round the situation with stagnation.
Growth again. We're all in favour of growth here, are we, Willie Rennie?
I agree with the general approach.
Michael, do you want to pass that on to Willie?
So I agree with the general approach that Kate set out. We argued previously for a penny on income tax for a specific purpose. But we said that would be the end of it. We gave a definite end point and we hypothecated it towards education. My fear is that I think the public don't trust the SNP on taxation anymore, and they don't know when the end point's coming. So when Humza was First Minister, I think he went wild. He was talking about progressive taxation as if it was going to go on forever. Now, I think John and Kate have probably got that under control a little bit, but they'll have to do a huge amount to convince the public, because we get it a lot on the doors. A lot of people are saying they can't believe the amount of extra tax they're paying. So irrespective of the facts that Kate set out, people believe that they're being taxed more than the rest of the UK. And when it goes, it goes. When people are making a choice in their life, Calum, this is important how this works. So if you're an NHS consultant and you've got a choice of a job in England or in Scotland, you will pick, if you're going to move your family, you'll move your family to England. We have got cases of people who are working in the wind industry that Geoff's just been talking about, who are choosing to do the job from their home in England, from working from home, rather than moving to Scotland, because they can do that and pay less tax. So we're going to get cases like that over time, and once that starts, it's going to be difficult to stop the flow. So that's why it's really important that we get the message across about taxation, that it's not going to go up forever, that it's going to be controlled, and that people know that they're not going to be hammered if they live in Scotland, because otherwise we're going to lose a lot of important people.
Well, so I'm going to ask Murdo a question in a wee second.
Good.
I think that's a really important point. So I mean, I know 2 NHS consultants who, on the back of the tax rises, the last set of tax rises, have decided to reduce their days from 5 to 4 because the marginal tax rate is so high. So taking 20% capacity out of the NHS. One of those is not my wife, by the way. We've got too many children to pay for, so she's not allowed to do that. But 2 other NHS consultants who are doing that. That's real, that's happening. And the issue the NHS has got is a capacity issue, and that's reducing capacity. It doesn't make any sense. But here's the interesting thing, and this is why, sorry for jumping in before Murdo, but it's pertinent. All of you are basically saying something similar, which is that we've sort of hit the ceiling and it's not working anymore. I've not, in 25 years of devolution, seen any party advocate a tax cut. Mm-hmm. Not one. Not even the Tories. And I've written a couple of those manifestos, and I can assure you it wasn't in there. Never, ever has anybody, and I don't think tax has ever actually been cut in the devolution era, ever. It's only ever gone up. Mm. So that's why I'm coming in and saying to Murdo, as the party that...
Non-domestic rates poundage was cut.
Non-domestic rates poundage was cut.
But it's a rate, tax.
At what point, though, surely what you're all saying is that this may have gone too far, so why is nobody talking about cutting it?
So a thought from Murdo, and then come back to you, Kate.
So, and Andy was writing Conservative manifestos pre-decimisation. It was so long ago. so these views are of limited value. So on the point Willie made, I'll come back to your question, Andy, in a second. But on the point Willie made, I think that's fair. Now the Scottish Parliament Economy Committee went to Prestwick Airport, I think it was the end of March, and we got to see all the fantastic things going on at Prestwick. Ryanair have got this facility, repair and maintenance of aircraft at Prestwick. They employ about 600 people. Fantastic. They want to expand that. What is the barrier to Ryanair expanding at Prestwick Airport? It's the fact they cannot recruit skilled aircraft engineers to move to Scotland because of the tax differential. Because skilled aircraft engineers earn £77,000. And they're being told by people, we're not coming to Scotland, because not only do we pay more income tax, the LBTT we pay to buy a family house in Ayrshire is way more than we would pay if we're buying a house in England. So people are not prepared to move, so it is having an impact. Now, coming back to Andy's point, I'd love to get to a position where we could use tax devolution, which we've had since 2016, to create a competitive environment in Scotland. If we could get a consensus around having lower tax rates in Scotland, just think about the opportunity to bring people in from other parts of the UK who would be higher earners. Kate was referring to the figures showing the population shift. We've lost, I think, 1,000 of the highest earners from HMRC figures. That's not necessarily people moving away. It might be people saying, you know what, we're going to work fewer hours because we're paying so much tax, it's no longer worth our while. Or people might be saying, instead of taking our income through income that's taxed, we'll receive it through dividends that are paid on a different basis. So we are losing people who could be major contributors to the tax base, and maybe if we had a more incentive and a lower tax rate, we'd bring more people in, and that'd be great for the Scottish economy.
So do it then. Put it in the manifesto.
Well, wait and see.
Yeah, okay.
I bet you it's not in the manifesto.
So do I.
If it was in, I wouldn't tell you, of course.
When will we see them at the Scottish Conservatives Manifesto?
Next Monday, I think, is coming out.
So what I don't understand about this debate, particularly, is let's face facts, right? We're focusing on income tax here, which is a devolved tax. There are one of two parties that are going to be in Butte House, either the Labour Party or the SNP, and who knows, it might be the lady to my right. Who knows after 2026? And there's one kind of stat that really bothers me about all of this, is that I know there's vagrancies in terms of national insurance and all the rest of it, but if you're earning between £45,500 and £50,000, you face a marginal tax rate of 50%. For every additional pound earned for people currently paid between these limits, 50p is taken in tax. For every pound, 50p is taken in tax. Now, these aren't your super high earners with yachts. These are police constables. These are experienced nurses. Now, I was in the SNP and we dined out in 2007, between 2007 and 2014, on the aspirational vote. These type of voters that wanted to get on in life. Yeah. I'm assuming the type of voters that Michael Mara's going after in 26 as well. And yet, to Andy's point, none of us are speaking bold on this measure of taxation in terms of its ability to almost adversely impact aspiration.
I think you're absolutely right about big parts of that, Geoff. The issue, I think, two things. We focus on the top rate of tax, and there's a lot of discussion about that, but the amount of money raised by fiscal drag and the number of people being pulled into higher tax rates by freezing the thresholds dwarfs the amount of money that might be raised by that. So you're absolutely right. It's those people between £40,000 and £50,000 that are actually paying the difference. Those are the people that are being hit. Now, people who are earning £28,500 are paying more tax in Scotland, but the people who are getting the biggest tax rises are those people who are in that bracket. It's a real problem. Your point, though, Andy, about the what that conversation now, you might say the Labour Party is not a natural party of cutting tax, and I think that's fair. But the level of demand in our public services and the need for reform and change in our public services is so high. The idea that we could countenance significant tax cuts now, when we're seeing an NHS that is on its knees, is just beyond the pale. You would have to be able to convince, I think, a huge portion of the electorate that you could drive really significant levels of growth through that tax cut. And I just don't think the evidence is there to say it around those kind of marginal rates. So that is the challenge. On the long run, if we can get growth back in the economy, if we can get our public services moving again, I do think the tax burden is too high for working people. But for too long, wages have been suppressed. That's why we're talking about the New Deal for working people, which is about raising wages for people in work. And that's how we actually deliver a better outcome for people.
I think we need a really geeky conversation about tax in this country. But I think that although we're talking about income tax, which is the only part that's devolved, and bear in mind it's only rates and bands that are devolved, none of the personal allowances and so on and gift aid, there's three things that this election could resolve for us. First is the effective rate of taxation and the marginal rate of taxation, which is entirely because allowances and national insurance contributions, for example, set at UK level, and we've got income tax rates and bands set at a Scottish level. And it's completely unfair. It's completely unfair. And hopefully Labour, might be Labour. It's probably going to be Labour. It's not going to be the SNP in power in London. But if they're serious about resetting the relationship with Scotland, that would strike me as one of the first areas to really resolve the problem. The second thing is we need a realistic conversation about our public finances. I mean, any suggestion right now that what parties are offering at a UK level is actually going to meet the need and meet the demand in public services. It's absolute nonsense. It just is absolute nonsense if you look. So our progressive rates of taxation have mitigated some of the worst effects. Now, I give you the example of the surgeon. Public sector workers in Scotland are on average paid more. That's a choice that we've made. And that needs to go hand in hand with being able to raise revenue in a different way. So if we do resolve the challenges and the pressures on our public finances, and the third one is a point of consensus, because if Labour in power in London can actually drive economic growth, which ultimately is a reserved matter when you look at it in the round. You know, import, export, there's a lot of things, immigration's a lot of things that are within the gift of a UK government. Then there could be an opportunity to relieve that pressure on our public finances, and it totally changes the conversation on tax.
We do now have surgeons, though, who are negotiating net pay deals with the NHS. So we've got a massive shortage in Dundee of breast cancer oncologists, people who are in consultant positions, and they're coming and not saying, do you get paid more? They're adding up, what do you get paid and what do you get taxed?
But it matters for the
and
carers.
That's part of the deal. So the people that
it
you
matters
bring
for
in.
the carers,
Of course
it matters for the nurses. They are paid on average higher, and that's a choice you make, and every government has to make those choices.
Willie Rennie?
The most important thing I think we should agree is that we've probably gone as far as we can go, and that's a significant step. The second thing is we need to understand that actually cutting public services at this time, because we're cutting taxes, is a difficult thing to do. So we've got to do it through growth, and we've got to manage over time. But to give confidence back to the taxpayer that this is the end of the increases, I think is an important and significant step, because that might stop the rot. My fear is, Kate, that you may not have seen the full effects of your tax rises, and more may come, and I think more may not stay here, more may not come here, and therefore, and it will be too late by then. So I think we've got to send a strong signal that this is the end of the increases.
Quick word from Murdo.
So, just going back to the consultants point, I know consultants who are friends of ours who now work 3 days a week out of 5 because it's simply not worth their while doing the extra 2 days. And also there's an issue around pensions in the NHS, which is, I think, trying to get resolved. But that's a big issue. But coming back to the broader finance point, what we don't acknowledge often enough in this debate, we have in Scotland around 20% to 25% more to spend per head of population on the public services compared to the UK average, thanks to the Barnett formula.
And the rurality and the challenges in Scotland.
But you would expect, therefore, public services in Scotland to be way better than the public services south of the border. The health service, education, justice, policing, you'd expect to see that come through, given we've got more money to spend. And we just don't see that money being spent as effectively as it should be on quality public services.
Okay, go on, Andy.
I think, so last week I was chairing a Q&A session that Willie was at for the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, and you said something, Willie, and I'll tell me if my paraphrase is incorrect, but it's sort of stayed with me since then. You said something along the lines of, there are areas where we could save money. There are cuts that could be made, but I'm not going to tell any of you what they are, because we don't operate in a political environment where I can do that without significant backlash, which I think is really depressing, to be honest with you. Because, and it goes back to something Michael said about the NHS. The NHS is demonstrably proven by figures to be the least efficient health service in Europe, and it's not even close. I mean, it is hopelessly inefficient. It gets a broadly similar amount of money to other places, but the output is dismal and the capacity is dismal compared to other countries. You could cut massive amounts out of the NHS budget and not affect a single patient. And you all know it, and I'm not blaming any of you, but our political culture doesn't allow any of you to see it.
Well, let's just check. How are we doing with microphones? Should we stick on the handheld one?
Can people at the back hear that? It's just me shut.
Or is that better?
Use
That is better, isn't it? Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, of course there are issues in terms of efficiency in our NHS, but one of the biggest reasons there's problems over the last decade is the collapse in capital investment that's led to no form of productivity increases in the NHS in comparison to the rest of Europe. We've seen capital investment choked off by the UK Tory government, and that's resulted we can't adopt technologies, we can't push that through our system, and so we're not getting more output per hour. That's a really significant reason why we've lost a lot of that productivity over the years. So I'd say that absolutely. If I can come back on something that Kate said about the direct challenge to the Labour government in this, if there is a Labour government, the question is about what is affordable. You know, we can't just continue. So I did a panel with, I think Geoff was at just last week when an SNP candidate was talking about Labour should be honouring the £28 billion commitment for the Green New Deal, and also we shouldn't have any windfall tax at all. I mean, spending billions and billions of pounds that we can't afford. We can't afford it as a country. We have to live within the means that we have. Yes, there will be borrowing, that's quite clear, but we can't get back in the situation of completely unfunded promises like we had from Liz Truss, and we all know what the repercussions of that for the working people we're talking about. So there is a limit to what we can do without that growth, which we have to focus on. Yeah.
One thing I want to do is just to say, if you've got a comment you want to make, having heard this conversation, stick your hand up, we'll get a microphone to you, because I want to do that. Rather than a question, any comments? Do you feel like you're hearing honesty? Do you feel like you're getting a clear plan from the politicians this evening? In 30 seconds, Kate.
I was going to say that this format really lends itself to something that hasn't happened in any hustings I've ever been on, which is mature debate and discussion. And actually, we talked about savings.
Not you, Geoff. Not you.
Let's do that on the poster.
You know, you talked about the NHS. You know, the biggest challenge facing the NHS right now is delayed discharge. And why are there so many people in beds in hospitals who shouldn't be there? Because of the staffing challenges in the community. Why is there staffing challenges? Because for years we depended on citizens from elsewhere in the world coming to live and work in Scotland. It's certainly a big part of it.
Work in Tesco's because they get paid more money.
Precisely, which goes back, that's precisely my point that you thankfully made for me, and it goes back to choices. I just talked about an increase, for example, in public sector pay, which was a choice that we made precisely because of the delayed discharge and the need to retain our staff. So this needs to be a frank conversation. Andy talked about where we need to reduce the pressure. There is a perfect example, but it's going to take more than a glib soundbite to solve that, and actually it needs a bit of cross-party
Okay,
consensus.
I want to just jump in. Sorry. Does anybody want to make a comment on what you've heard so far on tax? Maybe you don't. Do you feel like you're being taxed too much as a resident of Scotland, as somebody who lives in Scotland? No? A bit of shaking of the head from this woman? She doesn't want to say anything, though. Everyone's sitting very, very shy, aren't they? Oh, hang on, we've got somebody
I
on
can
here.
see a lot of people nodding.
Right, come on, Ed. Give it a run. Here comes Ed with your microphone. Stand by. Hold that thought. Lovely waistcoat, by the way. That's beautiful. Looks like tweed.
Very much. Just a brief comment.
Yeah, go on.
I'm encountering a large demographic in this country who are quite willing to shoulder the tax burden and perhaps even have it extended if they had any kind of faith that public services be run efficiently and properly, especially the NHS, where managerialism is leaching literally billions of pounds over the fiscal period.
Yeah. So you'd happily pay more if you got the public services. And that feels like there's some agreement in the room for that as well. Really interesting. So bear in mind, we want to take your comments this evening. Your analysis is really important. You get a chance to comment on what these four are saying. So make sure you take it. By the way, I think for the benefit of those who are listening to this podcast after, in the real spirit of consensus, we are now sharing one microphone between three of the people on the stage.
We're fighting over it.
I noticed that Michael Mara's holding on to it quite keenly there, so Murdo, just dive in there if you need it, or Willie, knock about if you have to. No, don't do that. Right, let's go on. We want to talk about energy. Of course we do. Geoff has outlined at the start of the podcast already this evening why energy is so important. It's a common and recurring theme on the podcast as well, which is crucial. Actually, is Tim in the audience? Tim Arbuckle. Have we got Tim? Maybe we do. Maybe he's just hiding. I'll read Tim's question out in any case. He says, I am indie sympathetic. Will Kate Forbes recognise that the SNP position on oil and gas licences is not pragmatic and is also costing them votes, especially in the northeast? If a question time, by some broadcaster that I've never heard of, if a question time audience is laughing, surely that tells you a straightforward message in reference to your
Actually, I think
recent
a
appearance.
question time audience tells us that this is a better format than question time.
We will take that as well.
Because in a complicated issue like a just transition,
Yeah.
bluntly, if you want a soundbite on the just transition, you ain't going to get one. So, from the SNP's perspective, we are not going to be forming the next UK government, right? We just aren't. So we're not going to be the ones in position of granting licences. So our position is that we want to be clear that there is a case for oil and gas on the basis of energy security, energy bills, and the just transition. Geoff can speak for himself in terms of the vision there. But the point stands that you cannot tell somebody today you're getting sacked and there might be a job for you in 10 years' time when offshore wind is fully set up. So there has to be a transition. Now, clearly in an election, you want that boiled down to a perfect little sentence in a manifesto of what that means. And we have said that our position is now that we will review applications for a licence on a case-by-case basis, led by the evidence. I appreciate not everybody likes that. I get that. People want you to be backed into a corner and be really clear as to whether you're for or against. And our position in this election is it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, analysing whether it's climate compatible, there is things like carbon capture that are being developed, or whether it is required in terms of reinvesting in renewables. And secondly, we can't get away from the fact that Ukraine and many other geopolitical uncertainties make the need for energy security more important than ever before. And my last point is that compared to 2021, even with the energy cap that's being introduced on the 1st of July, energy bills are on average £300 higher. £300 for a family that's struggling to get by is something that you can't ignore when it comes to the just transition. So my point is that just transition has become a phrase that we use very glibly and nobody stops to think what it actually means. It has to have justice in its heart and it's a process. It's not a start and a stop. And that's why I don't like the glib soundbite that Question Time really wanted me to give.
Murdo, quickly, and then we'll get to Geoff.
Okay, so I think I agree mostly with Geoff's analysis at the start of this programme in terms of what he said.
Worrying.
I know you should be worried, Geoff. And I think one of the most positive things, I think everybody on this panel will agree, maybe most of the audience, one of the most positive things that's happened in Scottish politics in the last year is that the Greens are no longer in government. So we are getting
does everyone agree with that?
No, I'm really disappointed.
Are you? Imagine.
So I think we are getting a more sensible discussion on energy than we did. And the SNP position has shifted, I think, since the Greens were in government. And Kate's trying very hard not to nod, but I think that might be the position, although it's still a bit of a fudge, I think, if I'm honest. The reality is, we have a just transition. We are going to, over a period of decades, reduce our reliance on oil and gas. That is a simple fact. However, we will still need oil and gas for decades. And even when we stop burning oil and gas, we're still going to need it because we still need a hydrocarbon system and energy to produce the things we sit on, the plastics we use, the clothes we wear. Plastics are in everything. We still need to have oil and gas being produced. And we either produce it ourselves or we import it from other countries. And it makes no sense at all to import it from other countries and therefore export the jobs and the economic opportunity. So I think we should be granting more licenses for the North Sea and deriving an economic opportunity from that for as long as we can.
Yeah, I'm going to let you pass the microphone to Michael, and I'll just say in between, it's because I can't agree with you, Murdo, you're a Tory, and it just feels so. But look, I want us to see an accelerated transition off oil and gas to renewables. Of course I do, but not at the risk of thousands of jobs, and most importantly, the R&D and the green technology that they are developing, because it is fantastic. And I would urge any of you on this couch, anytime you want to meet one of our supply chain companies, they will tell you exactly the same story time and time again. We are getting paid from our subcontracts with Equinor, Total, BP, Shell. That's funding us. And hey, look at this side factory that we're building for green hydrogen. Look at this side factory we're doing for high-value components for carbon capture, for offshore wind. It is so exciting. The place should be going like a fair. Scotland should be going like a bloody fair right now, and it isn't, because people are turning around their shoulders and going, these guys are trying to tax us out of existence. So yes, I don't think the presumption against oil and gas is coherent. I do not think giving Murdo, the oil and gas industry, 4 fiscal tax regimes in 2 years to invest in is a particularly coherent or helpful. I don't think Labour Party's position on no more oil and gas, but hey, we're going to need oil and gas for decades to come, but no more oil and gas. If you're an investor, you're going, bugger off. What does that mean to me? It's nonsense. It's nonsense. And Willie, I don't know what you've said in it, but I'm pretty sure I'm agreeing with you. But my point is this, guys. The critical mass is there, and it is ready to go, and it wants clarity. It wants an industrial strategy. And if I can just make one final point very briefly. There's Sandy Begbie here and a lot of financial services institutions in our audience just now. Not only do we have the ingredients to deliver energy transition, we have the ingredients to finance energy transition. And what a story we could tell our electorate if we could be the actual global leaders of not just delivering, but financing a green industrialization of our country. Please, please, try and reach some consensus on this point.
So it absolutely needs a plan, and a plan that can work. And, you know, Kate...
What does that mean? What does that mean? Give us the plan.
Let me say, first of all, I think that it means there are some difficult decisions that have to be taken.
Yeah, sure.
And
what's
there's
the plan?
a question. So the plan is basically to establish GB Energy, which is going to be a co-investment model, working with the private. Can't confirm or deny that. But to work co-investing with the private sector to put in place new technologies and develop mature technologies across Scotland to make sure that we can actually generate electricity, bring bills down, but at the same time get economic growth into the country so that we can actually have leadership in some of these industries. And so taking big, bold steps in that regard to make sure that we can take stakes in those companies as well and those projects to make sure we can get a return on investment for the country. I would say to Kate, it's great to hear the new policy, but it does feel that it's shifting on a pretty continuous basis. And I think it feels to me it's a little bit more to do with Stephen Flynn's job than it is to do with any of the other jobs in the northeast of Scotland at the moment. You know, he seems to be setting this agenda from the SNP. But what we do need is a properly worked out plan about how we get that transition. But there is a moral imperative at the back of this as well, which is about dealing with climate change, making sure that we can actually make our contribution to that globally. And we do think it has to be done at pace. But you're absolutely right in that it's incredibly difficult. People do not move to train for jobs that don't exist. And actually our failure over the last 14 years to actually create those supply chain opportunities has been marked. You know, and it's something that we have to do an awful lot better with a proper industrial strategy.
If you wouldn't mind just passing on to Willie.
There needs to be a bit more dullness and boringness within this policy area. I think there's far too much excitement. I think we need boring continuity. I think
straight in the manifesto.
I think I've read it today. That's in it. So, but what we need is, because if you look at it, when we were talking about the climate, we talk about ending the North Sea. When you talk about Ukraine, we talk about home security of energy. When we talk about jobs, we talk about making sure we continue North Sea oil and gas. The message for investors changes depending on the landscape, and that needs to stop. We need to have a bit of continuity, no matter what the environment is around it. Now, I think North Sea oil and gas will eventually come to an end. We know that. This is about how we manage that process. So geology is determining an awful lot of this. The other thing that should be determining this is our excitement about reducing demand. And we're not reducing demand nearly enough. We're not making enough progress. If there was more excitement about reducing demand than cutting off the supply, we might make a bit more progress about meeting our climate change obligations. So this is about how we do it. It's not whether it happens. We also need to put more investment and more time in the logistics of exploiting offshore wind. And what really worries me about offshore wind is we don't have, again, another boring point, we don't have enough planners to get the consent through on time. If we don't have enough planners, we'll have more Berwick banks that don't get approved on time. And that has a direct impact on the number of jobs that we create. And as soon as there is uncertainty within the system, the investors go, I'm not sure Scotland is the place for us because we're not sure they're going to match up to what we want. So certainty, boring continuity is what we need.
The Lib Dems are going to tax energy companies, though, aren't they? That's in the Lib Dem manifesto.
Yeah, we want to continue that as a short impact to have an investment within the sector.
Okay.
But that's all part of the continuity. It's about making sure people understand where you're going.
We talked a little bit, I think, with Kate and Murdo about just transition and what that means, right? Just transition means something similar to fair work and progressive taxation, which is actually nothing at all. It doesn't mean anything. It's wording that has been invented by government as a substitute for action. And that fundamentally, I think, is part of where the problem lies. We've just hired.
I don't agree with that.
Well, it doesn't mean anything in practice. It doesn't mean anything. Progressive taxation means high tax.
What it means is that we cannot allow to happen to the communities in the northeast of Scotland, across the country, what happened to industrial communities.
You don't need to give that a
otherwhere.
label. I mean, it doesn't mean anything.
Well, I think it's a commitment, and certainly when I speak to people, particularly in Aberdein, where I knock doors, that's what they want to hear, that actually there is a future for their kids, their grandkids, that there will be an economy that functions. And so it does mean something to those people, that actually there's a chance of a future, Andy. It's not, just because you don't get the policy detail that runs through it, and I take that as a good challenge, I think, from Willie, to actually say, how do you generate that plan and get consensus and build it right through? But there is actually a moral commitment to say, as long as we're meeting our climate commitments, we're not prepared to do it at the expense of the outcomes for the long term for generations of Scots to come. I think that's an important commitment to make.
Okay, but so we've just hired a new member of staff from Norway, right? I actually met her today for the first time, and I asked her about it. I knew this was going to come up tonight, and I said, what's the debate like in Norway about moving from hydrocarbons to renewables? And she said, well, there isn't really a debate. Other than the Greens, everybody knows what you do, which is that you use what you've got, and then you move on to the thing that's coming next. There's no discussion about whether we should stop or when we should stop or any of that. It's all integrated into one system. It's the same companies anyway, like it is here. Yeah. It's all the same. They're not tying themselves in knots using a variety of phrases and trying to come up with wording about exactly what they all know where they're going. And it's no secret that they're more successical at it.
So I think we all do know where we're going. The question of this is pace, isn't it? Isn't it? That's part of the challenge.
But Michael, they don't have a presumption against oil and gas in Norway. They don't have a presumption against oil and gas in the United States. I keep hearing from Keir Starmer and John Swinney and Hamza Yousaf, look at Norway, look at the United States, they're getting to net zero quicker. And neither of them have a presumption against. That's the point.
That's what I mean by pace.
But I mean,
There's questions about
there are
pace.
examples of where this is working. I mean, this all suggests that doom and gloom and none of this is working. It is working, and there's a lot to be optimistic about. And my commitment coming into government literally just 2 weeks before the election was called is how do we take the good practice and make that the norm? So we had the two examples. The first week I came into government, it wasn't cause and effect, had nothing to do with me, but was Sumitomo, £350 million, cable factory, that is supply chain. And that's not actually just about the Northeast, that is about the Highlands. Yep. So this is a national industry. And then we had Haventus. £50 million from the Scottish Government, essentially, Scottish National Investment Bank, £50 million from the UK side. Wow, governments working together, controversial. But supporting the redevelopment of Aberdein Airport, which could create 3,000 jobs in the Highlands. That is phenomenal. So it is happening. I think the big question for us is not whether it's going to happen or not. The just transition is going to happen. It is going to happen. Led by the private sector, it's going to happen. The question is whether it will accidentally just evolve or it will happen by design, leaving legacy benefit for communities, for our nation, and for the jobs that it will create. And that is the massive prize and goal that we all need to be focused on.
Murdo?
Okay, two things very briefly to add, because I actually agree with a lot of what's being said. Firstly, skills. We're going to have to train up a lot of people to take on these jobs. Not enough is happening. Apprenticeship levy is a huge issue for firms because they pay the apprenticeship levy, it disappears into the Barnett formula, and they don't see it coming back. So we need to make sure there's appropriate support for apprenticeships. And the second thing is, and this is a bit left field, but we need to stop persecuting energy companies who are trying to do the right thing and stop this nonsense of encouraging divestment from energy companies who are currently involved in oil and gas, but are involved in the just transition, because if we're not seeing people like BP and Shell and Exxon actually able to attract investment, they won't be able to invest in the new jobs, in the new economy. So all this nonsense about hitting people like Baillie Gifford really has to come to an end, and the spoiled brats who are pursuing this need to be put firmly in their place.
Interesting. Murdo, just to stick with you, just as a very final one on this. I was reading this from the CBI. At the end of 2023, there were over 500 renewable energy projects in the Scottish planning pipeline, with a potential capacity of over 25 gigawatt. The trick is delivering them, a problem right across the UK because of planning systems fraught with snags, tripwires and skills shortages. So I think there's two parts to this, Murdo. The Conservative government that's been in Westminster, why would it not unleash the potential of Scotland's energy sector? And will the Scottish Conservative leader, Russell Finlay, work on these sorts of issues?
Well, Andy Maciver's running Russell Finlay's campaign, so you should ask him that.
Well, in that case, he won't win,
question.
will he? That's where we're at.
Well, not historically.
But you take my point. We've had years of issue here, years of just quagmire and nothing happening.
And yet, when I speak to developers, they say the planning process for offshore wind south of the border is easier than the planning process north of the border, because this is devolved. So there are particular issues affecting Scotland. But you're absolutely right. And I remember meeting, when Neil Gray became Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Kate's predecessor but one, and we had a meeting, and he said to me, what was the first thing I could do to try, what was the important thing I could do to try and sort out and improve economic growth in Scotland? And I said to him, Neil, you need to sort out the planning system. That's the biggest single barrier to economic growth and development in Scotland, is planning.
Interesting. Geoff?
One very quick final thought. The Labour Party have, as Michael pointed out, being very realistic with the fiscal position they're faced, and reduced their Green Prosperity Plan quite significantly. We also know from the Climate Change Committee that the Scottish Government would have to spend £1.1 billion per annum on getting to net zero. That's about 18% of their capital budget, so it ain't going to happen. That just can't happen. I just wonder, if we can bring the two governments together, whoever they may be, post-election, and think pretty creatively about who has the money here. And instead of trying to tax companies out of existence and out of the North Sea, saying, right, you buggers, right, you're in there, incentivise renewables. If you demonstrate per your revenue over cost, however you want to do it, that you're investing heavily in renewables, you don't have to face a certain tax burden. Bring them on the journey with you. But it's clear, because with public finances are so tight, they don't have the cash, governments don't have the cash, we don't have the cash, they have the cash. So bring them on the journey with you.
So there's two things we need to fix here.
One
is that relationship.
Quick, yeah.
One is the relationship between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, which has become completely dysfunctional.
Will that be better after 2026, do you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that will be a core offer in terms of when we go into 2026. But I hope, frankly, it's better if we win the election in 3 weeks' time. Because we need to do that, and we need to make that relationship work for the whole of the UK, but for Scotland in particular, and we've said that in our manifesto. But the other thing that makes things investable is economic stability, not 5 chancellors in 3 years, 3 prime ministers, and absolute bloody chaos. That's what across not just this industry that we're talking about, whether it be financial enterprise, whether it be any other part of the economy, when I speak to people, what they want is sensible decision making and stability at the top of government, which they have not had for a decade. It has to happen. More boring, as Willie says.
More boring, says Willie Rennie. Thoughts, anybody? Does anybody want to pass comment, pass judgment on what you've heard? No? You all happy? There's a hand just in the middle aisle there, Ed, if you want to go and see that, the woman there. More boring in politics. Gosh, would that work on a podcast? I don't know. Good evening to you. What's your name? What would you like to say?
It's Lorna Finlayson. Just on the energy debate, what I think we're failing to do is actually take revenue from these international companies that are coming in and taking all our energy resources. What are we doing to get a grip and copy some of the other countries in the world who actually benefit financially, not just from jobs, not just from the economy, but from actual income?
So I think it's bigger than just actual income. I think it's leaving legacy, which is what I mentioned before. The big problem, I think, with oil and gas is that if you drive from the oil and gas production hub of Aberdein to the oil and gas servicing hub of the Cromarty Firth, the road is dreadful. That's a different subject, a different conversation. What is the legacy from these conversations? Because actually, the UK government took the revenue in the billions and didn't leave much of a legacy behind. For me, the answer to that question lies in what will happen with the supply chain. So £25 billion has been promised of the licensing round in terms of offshore wind, ScotWind, floating wind. and £25 billion has been promised to invest in the supply chain. Now, one of the problems where we have to work together is the Scottish Government doesn't have the power to dictate and determine that that must happen. We get a commitment from them in terms of local content, but actually in terms of guaranteeing it will happen, we need to work with the UK government. But for me, if you get that £25 billion invested in little businesses in and around the North East and the Highlands and in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and create the jobs, create the secure jobs, that is the legacy that will actually completely end the cyclical impact of poverty in some of these communities to a much greater extent than just taking the top revenue of these companies and never seeing it again for decades.
On Scotland, we absolutely undersold. So we struck at a far lower price than we should have done, and there's been a big loss to the public purses with regard to that. But we also have to make sure, and GB Energy is designed to do this, to take stakes in these investments, to make sure we get return for our public investment and the natural assets in this country, that we can return that money back into bills, back into services, and that's what we should be doing.
I think Willie wanted 30 seconds.
I have a slight anxiety that we might have actually consented or given licences out for too many in one go. Because we need to make sure we build the capacity within Scotland to build the jackets, to build the capacity, the servicing. And it might all come too quickly if we're not careful. Now, that's contrary to what I've just said about the whole planning and licensing process. But we need to make sure that we're doing exactly what Kate says, that we get a return. I'm afraid the track record so far with regards to BIFAB, where we couldn't even build 8 jackets, and in fact BIFAB disappeared, is not a good track record. We need to learn from that, build the capacity, get the jobs here, and to do that we need a plan that works, and I'm not quite sure that we've got that yet.
Interesting. Can I just say, there's a lot of I agree with happening on the stage this evening, isn't there? Is anybody else noticing that? Maybe it's just me. I feel like I'm in a fever dream. Gather your thoughts, because in a little while we'll say goodbye to the politicians. We'll have a kind of open conversation, and you can be a big part of that as well. Just want to go on to another part, actually, of Scottish Financial Enterprises Manifesto today, which describes a number of this is a quote, a number of structural challenges that are impacting the strength of our labour market. They say universities and colleges are under huge financial pressures, that people are leaving the workforce permanently. We have an ageing population which intensifies pressure on the existing workforce. Willie, let's stick with you on this. We want to consider kind of skills, education, the calibre of person, people, worker in Scotland, and whether that is a challenge that we should be grappling with in light of this election campaign.
I actually think the James Withers review is actually not a bad start. I think it's a pretty good programme. It sets out a kind of programme for careers, advice to change, to bring the funding under one central pot. And I think Graham Day as a minister has done a reasonable job with starting that. I'm slightly concerned that the pace of progress on this isn't fast enough. And the big thing we need to do is a cultural change. And it's a cultural change around parity of esteem. I think if I had started off my education again, I wouldn't have gone off and done a degree. I might have done an apprenticeship, because the range of apprenticeships now is far, far superior than whatever was offered when I was leaving school. And I think we need to get that message spread to parents, to teachers, so that they understand. That's why the careers offer is really important, because we're not getting the right people in the right places in order to get the potential maximised from offshore wind and other industries. The second one I'm worried about, I'm just going to squeeze it in with regards to universities. Now, Scottish universities in terms of research really punch above our weight, or have punched above our weight within the UK. We used to get 15% of the UK Research Council funding. In the last REF, the means of measuring it, it went down to 12.5%. And that's partly because we haven't got the funding of Scottish universities right. And therefore we're cross-subsidising with international students in particular, and they're going down as well. So there is a warning sign about universities, who are a major force of not just skills and educated people, but also research, which is a major driver of the economy. And we need to have a close eye on that sector, together with colleges who have been underfunded, actually underloved for many, many years. So I think the government's got, with the Withers Review, the right structure, but we need to make sure we change the culture in society to respect apprenticeships, so we can get the right people in the right places.
There's a lot in that, and college funding is always overlooked and deserves a lot more attention, doesn't it? Perhaps it can be part of this conversation. Go on, Andy.
Scotland's biggest short-term problem is economic growth, right? And I think that everybody breathed a bit of a sigh of relief at the incoming Swinney Forbes era, because I think that it was a high-level smoke signal that there was a bit of a stabilisation and an agreement that economic growth was actually important, which was in question before that, so that's fine. But I think Scotland's biggest long-term problem is actually education, allied to population and demographics, and the fact that our school system is struggling, really, really struggling. You look internationally at how our schools are performing, it's very, very poor. We are creating large numbers of very mediocre academically achieving children. We have a bit of an allergy in schools, especially in state schools, a bit of an allergy to excellence now, to be honest. I mean, the curriculum for excellence is as big a misnomer, I'm afraid, as what you'll see. And I think it's a very, very significant long-term problem, which is boring, right? But actually, if we fix that, if we try and reintroduce a bit more excellence into the system, we will solve a lot of problems in 10, 20, 30 years' time. But the other thing, I'm afraid, is tuition fees. I mentioned at the start, right, nothing's free and neither is education. But
Willie's leaving, he's running.
Everybody in this room, everybody who works in a big organisation will know, everybody will know somebody who's gone to an English university because they can't get into a Scottish one. This is real. This happens, and these people don't come back. And if they don't get the place that's available according to the quota for their course, as I say, they'll go elsewhere. But one of the oddest things is, even if you want to keep a kind of quote-unquote free system, we're not even allowing Scottish kids to pay. We're locking them out, even if they wanted to pay to stay here and go to a Scottish university. So talk about brain drain. We're kind of creating it ourselves. And I know that a policy like free tuition, quote unquote, sounds wonderful and everybody wants it. But in practice, we have to be grown up enough to say, is this actually working? Or do we need to look again at this system?
Okay.
I know you keep looking at me.
I know, I think you want to say something.
Rocks and sun?
Selected drivers of economic performance latest year, right? This is OECD, ONS, Scottish Government, Eurostat. International exports were 4th quartile, the lowest. Business investment, 4th quartile. Innovation active firms, 3rd quartile. Percentage of our workforce educated to at least degree level were in the 1st quartile. So that tells me that we're educating our people to a pretty high standard, but for some godforsaken reason, we're not managing to manifest that self into business investment and opportunities and retaining our talent. It's not necessarily disagreeing with what you're saying about your views and curriculum for excellence, but we're still producing a very talented workforce. What I don't understand is, why have we not had the consolidation, the coherence around our further career opportunities beyond that? Because we are producing the talent. Why are they not staying?
So as somebody who went to an English university and doesn't talk about it very much, but came back, I did come back, people do come back. The point I think that Geoff makes is absolutely the right point. So when it comes to economic growth, when it comes to business growth, you actually need to go back to the data. And what the data tells us is that we do have the talent and the skills. One of the first announcements I made in the new job was money for basically startups. I went round all of these startups that had chosen to be headquartered here in Scotland, asked them why, and they said it was access to talent and skills. That's anecdotal, but it backs up what you're saying, Geoff, in terms of the data. The 2 points that I would make is that first, we have an aversion to risk and an aversion to failure, and the countries which have the highest number of startups that go on to succeed are those that have failed multiple times along the route and are actually okay with it. I think that's the first thing. And secondly, it's about the Withers report, and it's about refocusing our education system on the skills of the future, which are actually now the present. So I talked about the 3,000 jobs that might come out of the redesign of the Port of Aberdein. 3,000 jobs. And we need the University of the Highlands and Islands to be ready to ensure there's a pipeline of 3,000 people. And if we don't, in a country of only 5 million people that has a huge challenge of depopulation, we need to have a much more positive conversation about immigration. And we need to have a skills-based immigration system that allows people and recognises that actually immigration is one of the biggest economic contributors to our success as a country.
Okay, I'll pick up two different issues if I can. The first is economic inactivity is too high. There are too many people in the country of working age who are not currently working and contributing for lots of reasons. Some of these folk, I'm afraid, are stuck on NHS waiting lists, waiting for operations. Some of them are on welfare long term. We need to do more to encourage that cohort back into the workplace. On immigration, Keir Starmer said in a debate last week, he said, the UK's had a very liberal immigration policy, and that's actually true. You look at the numbers, since Brexit, the numbers of people coming into the UK, the net inflow has doubled since Brexit. So lots of people are coming into the UK. Not enough of them are coming to Scotland. And that's not a problem with the visa system, because they're coming in, they're just not coming to Scotland. We need to think about why we're not attracting enough people who are coming in to come and work in Scotland. That might be a cultural issue, it might be an issue around economic opportunity, it might go back to the tax rates, there might be lots of different factors, but we need to see how we attract more people in. And if whoever wins the election is talking about tightening the visa and immigration system, which I think will happen, I think we need to look in Scotland as to how we make sure we're getting at least our population share of the people coming in.
Just before you pass the microphone on to Michael Mara, I feel I should ask if you think the Conservatives will win the election.
Of course.
We were asking for
great opportunity. Nobody has cast a single vote yet in this election. The postal votes are only arriving later this week. Everything is possible.
Really credible.
Everything is possible, Calum.
Feel like I've heard that line before. Let's pass it on to Michael Mara then on what we're talking about here on skills and education, etc.
Yeah, and Andy says that it's a long-term problem around education. I mean, we have a real short-term problem in our higher education sector, where we now have, I think, 14 universities that are in significant financial strife this year, and it'll be worse next year. So we're projecting a further 25% decline in the number of international students, and in Scotland we are particularly exposed to the international student flows because we don't pay the full cost of tuition for Scottish students. So I think it's 79% of the cost of a Scottish student is paid by the Scottish Government via the Scottish Funding Council, and actually the rest has to be made up by international student recruitment. So it's a huge issue for us, and actually the whole sector is creaking as a result. And Willie's points on that, he knows I'm obsessed with this. So, I used to sit on the education committee together. That decline in terms of the research performance is not just the canary in the coal mine around this. It's about a brain drain from people who can't get the kind of research opportunities that they want in Scotland. I spent, before I came into Parliament, the last 10 years trying to recruit people into PhD programmes in machine learning and artificial intelligence in Scotland. And frankly, I'm not sure I ever saw a Scottish name cross my desk. The people, because we have choked off the supply, we don't get young kids because the number of people who are taking STEM qualifications in our schools is collapsing. We don't have enough teachers in those areas. As a result of that, there's a fewer going to undergraduate courses, then postgraduate courses, and the kind of tech sector opportunities that were pointed out, that Kate's talked about, are going to dry up as a result. There's no doubt about that, and they are already incredibly centred on Edinburgh. We've got a rising GVA in Edinburgh, but right across the rest of the country, there's a real problem in this regard. So, it's right that we celebrate it where it works, but our structural problems are really, really significant. I think there's probably going to be an awful lot more of this, I would imagine, in the run-up to 2026,
sure.
I have to say, in terms of the devolved and reserved distinctions. But it is absolutely a massive current issue.
But you have it within your gift, your colleagues at Westminster, assuming you take 10 Downing Street, to be part of the solution. So I think we all recognise Scotland has a long-term working age population decline. So will you, as there is precedent under Jack McConnell, agree in this new spirit of consensus with the SNP to put in place a targeted immigration policy to allow the skills that we need to support the industries of the future, particularly for Scotland?
We've been really open about, we think that we need to look back at the example of what Jack achieved in terms of the post-study work visa and make sure that we can try and develop schemes with the Scottish Government that can help us in that regard. I think we've got, I do have a really long-term, and it comes actually to the heart of many of the discussions we're having about public services. Our demographic problem in Scotland is huge, but we've known about it for 20 years. Yeah. And frankly, we've done absolutely nothing about it. And now we're seeing the consequences from so much of that flowing through and that's, again, it's about political instability, people with their pet projects, wasting the public's time, and rather than focusing on the needs of the country.
I do think it is also about political rhetoric. So actually, how often do you hear a positive message about immigration? And I think you do hear that in Scotland. And, I think our party is probably the most pro-immigration right now, looking at the challenges. But if it works in Canada, why not in the United Kingdom, of a devolved approach to immigration? And if we recognise that there are particular pressures in certain sectors, we should be able to tailor a scheme to that. And that would be my encouragement to the Labour Party, is to look at how you take a more sort of national and regional approach to immigration.
I mean, the big elephant in the room is Brexit, and nobody's mentioned Brexit, and it's a fact it's had a massive impact on our economy, but it's also sent a message out to the world that this place is closed, we've pulled up the drawbridge. No, that's true.
Free Brexit.
But the message to the talented people across the world is that we've closed. The people are coming from the other parts of the world because we are under huge economic turmoil and war across the world, and that's why there's massive movements of people.
But from India, I mean,
but we need to send a message that we want talented people, and Brexit's part of that. That's why we've lost huge tranches of health workers and care workers and so on.
So how are you proposing sending the message, rejoining the EU?
Well, I think we need to get closer in a pragmatic relationship with Europe. I think there's no desire to go back into a big battle over the Brexit years, but I think a pragmatic, I have to say, boring realignment with Europe to make sure that we can break down, I know I'm really boring, to break down those barriers on professions and trades, on veterinary, on Horizon, making sure we're fully exploiting that, on Erasmus, all of those things we should be doing to send a message to the rest of the world that this place is for talented people, and that will help us. But one final thing, we need to be careful about conflating the demographic challenges with the skills challenges, because the Jack McConnell solution back in the Lib Lab government was all about skills shortages. The demographic shortages are a much, much bigger challenge, and we won't sort that by bespoke schemes to do that. But we should start with a bespoke scheme to deal with some of the skills shortages.
There we are. I've actually just realised that the Liberal Democrats and Labour are sat on the same sofa.
Yeah.
Sign of things to come.
What does that mean for us?
Right, we are about to say goodbye to the politicians, so if you would like to land a point, you have got a minute or so to do it. Would anybody like to say anything, to comment on what you've heard? Yeah, down at the front here. Ed is running. Well, he's not, but I'm trying to encourage him to. Here we go. Very quickly, because we do have to wrap up pretty sharpish.
Sure. Hi, Sarah Cham Prosper. Our standard of living in the UK is weaker than most, and we know that doing something about productivity holds the key. What are the three things you do about productivity?
I'm going to have to give you like 10 seconds per thing, because we do have to get there. Go on, Willie. Very quickly.
Skills, regulation, planning.
Nice, Willie.
Well done, Willie. Boring, very boring.
Go on, Kate.
I was going to say population, increased private investment, and I do think consistent regulation.
Consensus. Go on, Michael.
Capital infrastructure, investment in technology.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Murdo?
I don't disagree. Skills, investment, and sensible regulation that doesn't get in the way.
Okay. Anyone else? You've got 30 seconds, literally, to get your hand up and say something to the politicians. We're back down. I'm sorry, Ed. We're back down at the front. Right, go on. And then I really have to say goodbye to them. Go for it.
Hi, thanks. Victoria from the WISE Group. We have heard the notion of poverty and social mobility once or twice this evening, but the two things are extremely persistent in Scotland. And my comment is around a plea, really, to all of you to ensure that the conversations that you have and the policies that you consider are considered with that lens as well, because all too often, nice, new, shiny policies are not attainable by people who are vulnerable and in poverty.
Well, that is a plea. Can we just acknowledge that you've all taken that on board?
Yeah.
Plea acknowledged.
Yeah.
And people, the poorest people in Scotland and across the UK are poorer than anywhere else in Europe at the moment, any of our comparator countries.
Okay.
It's an absolute disgrace. We need an economy that works for everybody.
Yeah. These four have taken time out of a general election campaign to spend this evening with us. We're very grateful for that. So please can you thank our four politicians for taking part. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good to see you. Willie, thank you very much. Thank you. That was great. Right, good. Thanks, Murdo. Nice one. Cheers. Gosh, goodness me. Right, has anyone got any hand sanitizer?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to need it.
Good grief, it's going to be a super spreader event. They're getting their photos done, apparently. Who knew that was going to be a thing? Kate Forbes, Murdo Fraser, Michael Mara, and Willie Rennie. We're into the post-match analysis phase. If anyone's got a big touch screen that they want to use, or tactics they want to talk about, I really would love to hear from you on what you've heard from these four this evening. Geoff and Andy, first of all. Geoff, we've come into this. We've called it growing Scotland's economy. Does it feel like we heard some solutions, a way forward here? We'll welcome Sandy up in a second for his thoughts. What are yours?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I think there's an old adage that there's more that unites us than divides us, and actually, Andy and I get the privilege of meeting these politicians on a regular basis and interviewing them, and actually, what you find when you actually drill down into a conversation, there is a lot more that aligns them. What we need to see is delivery. So, our living standards have not improved since 2010. Real wages have not improved since 2010, right? We're not experiencing the growth we need to see. So, words are welcome, actions, delivery, that's what we need to see.
I think the gap between what politicians are prepared to say and what people are prepared to hear is the biggest it's ever been.
Right.
So I think politicians totally underestimate how ready the public is for discussions that they don't think they're ready for. Now, it's 2 weeks away from a general election, right? So they're not, they actually said a lot more than they might have ordinarily 2 weeks ahead of a general election.
Yeah.
But there are big, big issues that are still untackled. And I think the key test is, will they be tackled after the election before 2026? So we talked about it before. There's huge amounts of discussion about tax. And they came as close as they were ever going to come to say tax is already too high. None of them said they would cut it.
Yeah.
Not a single one of them still was prepared to talk about the fact that some of the money that gets spent by government, our money, taxpayers' money, is not spent well. It's pretty logical. I think most people in the public would acknowledge that there must be money that's not spent well, but nobody will really talk about it. So I do think there's this, particularly since COVID, I think the gap between people are prepared to hear on things like the state pension, on things like the NHS, on growth. I think people are much more ready for a mature message than politicians are giving them credit for. Now, we'll give them a free pass because, if they say something, it'll be in a leaflet or a Twitter meme by 9 o'clock, right? But I don't think we'll give them a free pass after the election. I think it's time then to be a bit more grown up about it.
So, Sandy rejoins us from Scottish Financial Enterprise. Sandy, what did you make of it? Did you hear what you wanted to hear, frankly?
I think a bit like what Geoff said, I think there was a lot of alignment. There was more alignment than I probably expected. Interestingly, I've always felt on skills and education, my engagement with the parties across Scotland privately, so outside that sort of public debate, is that they are really aligned behind it.
Right.
And I've encouraged them all to say, look, why don't you get a cross-party group together to actually look at the education system, and actually have that grown-up conversation around how do we put this on a proper footing over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
In terms of the questions around economic growth, I didn't hear any what I would say was courageous or ambitious suggestions as to how that might be delivered. I think there was an acceptance around oil and gas, which I thought was quite refreshing. But what was lacking, and maybe it is 2 weeks out, there wasn't anything I would say was really bold around delivering economic growth.
Is there a reality check here, though, that actually boldness in this general election is remarkably difficult? Because whoever wins, and the polls suggest it will be Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, nothing's going to get better very quickly for anyone. And actually that is the reality of what we're facing. So boldness in the face of that challenge is almost impossible.
But the danger is if you don't think bold, all you'll do is just continually tweak what you're doing.
Yeah.
So you've got to, I think, and to Andy's point, I think there's an appetite in the public, certainly in business, to have proper, honest conversations about some of the big issues that are just not working.
And one thing that we didn't get onto tonight, but was in your manifesto, and it's a big issue that I think they could find alignment on quite easily, is infrastructure, investment in infrastructure. Our infrastructure is really poor. We've got the Institution of Civil Engineers in the room tonight. We've got Covey in the room tonight, who have international experience in infrastructure, and we don't compare well on infrastructure. So investment, private investment, frankly, in infrastructure is a policy area that I think a lot of them could get behind, because it's a pretty basic conversation with the public.
Yeah.
If you want stuff, we have to find a different way to pay for it than through your tax. And they're ready for it. That's not, I mean, it's not a difficult conversation. I think they're quite ready for conversations like that. So there are, and that drives economic growth very significantly, infrastructure spend. So we could do these things in certain areas.
I think one of the most disappointing things about this election contest is Labour are so far ahead in the polls. So far ahead. So I've been in a position where you have your different scenarios. When you come to your manifesto, when you come to your election campaign, how far are you going to go? What announcements are you going to make? And they're so far ahead that they're sitting there going, we don't really need to push the envelope here. We're done and dusted. We don't need to put ourselves up there to be judged by another facet of our policy. And so Labour are getting through this because they're not the Tories. Now, they say a lot about change. I don't know what change truly means. Probably with the exception of Wes Streeting. I think he's been pushing the envelope on NHS, which is pretty impressive from him in terms of his ability to take forward quite a difficult debate. You've got GB Energy, but Michael Mara's probably the best Labour politician I've heard trying to explain what GB Energy is so far, and I mean that in terms of his UK counterparts as well. So they're just sitting there going, we'll get through this, and then easy as she comes. Now the problem with that is, of course, that after the election day, folk will go, so what is going to be different then?
Wes Streeting.
And then, sorry. Carry on.
No, I'm just
you interrupted me. Carry on.
Yeah, no, I did. You can do that again in a second. Wes Streeting is I think the only politician in the UK at the moment who is doing the exact thing that I just called for politicians to do.
Okay.
Which is just telling the truth about the state a service is actually in and saying things that normally a Labour politician wouldn't say and saying things that frankly no politician would say because they'd be too scared of the public. But the public are embracing it just fine because they are ahead of most politicians on that issue. So Wes Streeting I would absolve him from criticism in an argument like that.
Go on, Sandy.
Just come back on Andy's point on infrastructure. So we hear four things consistently from investors. One is the lack of scalable, well-developed pipelining projects. Secondly is planning and consents. Third is supply chain, including skills. And fourth is the general business environment. How welcoming are we? And all four of those things consistently come up as being issues in the minds of investors. Capital is not the barrier here. There's plenty of capital. Capital will find its way to the most attractive investments. But those four things, some of which are devolved to Scotland, and we should have within our gift to address, but these have been around for years now, and nothing is shifting.
I'm really keen to hear from you. We've got 150 people in the room here in Edinburgh tonight. How are you reflecting on this, on the general election campaign? And actually, let's bolt onto that. If there's something you've always been burning to ask Geoff or Andy or both, now is your time. Would anyone like to take part in the podcast? Yes, up at the back. Oh, you're right beside Eddie, doesn't need to run. Hello, what's your name?
Hi, my name is Jack.
Hi, Jack.
So this is kind of a point, but seeing as you asked for a question, I will think of one on the fly.
Go for it.
So actually the point is around what Andy mentioned about these kind of like somewhat meaningless words and phrases. And I think in Scotland, these like kind of words and phrases, well-being economy, transition, and then even Kate mentioned like the startups, like these words and phrases set the tone for a lot of the actual decision making and in policy and in actual implementation of the things that help or should help our economy grow. So if you've ever filled out a Scottish enterprise form, well-being economy and net zero transition are at the core of this, and they're interpreted very differently by lots of different people inside all these enterprise agencies and government and entrepreneurs and investors. Everyone has their own. If you ask me what well-being economy is, I will give a different definition to Kate Forbes.
Okay.
And it's just a complete mismatch, and it just gets in the way. So my question is really, all these words and phrases, particularly in Scotland ahead of 2026, very SNP kind of pushed. How do we get rid of the words and phrases and kind of open up the conversation so we don't like kind of exclude out people that think, I'm not a startup. Because when Kate Forbes says startup, she means tech company. But when I hear startup, I think business under 6 years old. So,
Jack, I think you've hit a real raw nerve, particularly for me. I hated the phrase well-being economy. I understand its intentions, its good intentions, but a well-being economy to me is is something that is, if you're earning more money, you can spend on your family, you've got more disposable income, you can spend it on other things that you like to do. That to me is being well-being, and that should be what we always aspire to do. It's called sustainable economic growth. That's the purpose of this discussion tonight. And I think to give you some reassurance, a bit of encouragement, Jack, and to others that think like this, if we were having this debate 4 or 5 years ago, and we called it Growing Scotland's Economy, and we talked about economic growth so openly, we'd have been shouted down by some people. I'm telling you, because they were talking about well-being, inclusive, and this thing, and all the nature positive, all the rest of it, and all noble things. They mean fuck all to anyone. Sorry, they don't. And we need to focus on the real things that matter, the real people's priorities. All of you in the room who are worried about where the next paycheck's coming, they're worried about how they're going to fund their kids' education. And if we can get back to that, and I feel we're turning a wee bit of a corner in our discourse now, we're getting back to some common sense. Sandy, I know you like well-being economy.
Andy, did you want to say something on the way to Sandy?
Just that it's not only that some of these terms are meaningless, it's that they actually actively make the situation worse.
Yeah.
Because they prevent action which would help the people in society who need the action the most. We're hiding behind this terminology so often that we actually sometimes prevent the action that we would take if we just talked in straighter terms about it. So it's this illusion of being progressive and being friendly, which actually is just crowding out action that would help people.
Yeah,
I think probably one of the most disappointing things around all this language is unfortunately the government and civil service then spend months and months and months trying to define it. So if you then talk about the inefficiencies that sit in the system, people are then deployed, and then of course someone else comes along the following year and of course removes part of that language and then introduces a new bit of language. It's pretty scandalous, actually.
Yeah. Anyone else got a point, a question, an assessment, a witty joke? Somebody down at the front here. This is good. I like this.
Yeah,
this is
sorry for swearing. I promised I
No, it's
wouldn't
fine.
do it again. And
We'll have
You
to
lasted almost the entire show.
I know,
We'll
I'm
have to
annoyed
get-
myself. My fiancé will kill me, man.
We'll get the beep machine out. It's fine. Hello, what's your name?
Hi there, I'm Carolyn Lockhead from the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Andy mentioned earlier that he was at our conference last week.
I'm sorry.
to
Jeff's
chair,
available for next year.
He was
Sorry,
there
go
to
on.
chair a Q&A with Alistair Campbell, which he did with great skill, and we were very grateful.
You were on stage with Alistair Campbell.
I was, yeah.
How was that?
He's got a podcast.
Does he?
Yeah, apparently.
Nah, go on.
And one of the things that Andy heard was our members talk about the fact that they employ over 12,500 people across Scotland. They house over 500,000 people across Scotland. It's a really important contributor to the economy. And I guess I reflect quite a lot on the fact that we have these debates, which are great. We don't really talk about housing very much. We certainly hear from a lot of businesses that they would like to expand, they would like to employ more staff. They cannot find the homes for them. And our members, housing associations, are desperate to build new social homes which keep people out of poverty. And it's very, very hard. I just wonder if that's something that we need to get more into the debate.
Well, I wonder, since you've said that, if we should commit to doing a housing special at some point.
Yeah.
In that case, on the podcast. Would you be up for that? Would you be open to that? Yeah.
And sponsorship.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Always the businessman.
Elephant in the room there. It's a bit, one thing that, so Willie was at that event, and actually Willie, I thought dealt with, speaking to an audience that would not naturally be supportive of, for example, the private rented sector. Willie Rennie stood up at that audience and said, guys, you've got to stop this war with the private sector. Rent caps aren't working. They're making life worse for them and for you and for everybody. I thought Willie dealt with that actually all quite well. But one other thing Willie did, and Alistair Campbell had kind of emphasised this the day before as well. Willie said, we should have a cabinet secretary level post for housing. Housing's always been a junior ministerial level post, but it's a thing that affects people, more than probably any other public service. Housing affects people in a way that even the NHS sometimes doesn't affect people, and it's never actually been elevated to that sort of level. I thought that was quite interesting, especially in the run up to 2026. Why does housing, and it's not just important for people who need homes, it's also another driver of economic growth as well. We know how much investment's sitting on the sidelines waiting to be invested in what is currently seen as a pretty hostile environment, actually. For housing. But again, it all works together, and it's an interesting point as to whether it should be elevated at cabinet level.
Yeah, I mean, housing is a supply and demand, and the demand is there. The problem is that the rent controls are then constraining the supply, and in the financial services, we're aware that there are literally, £2 or £3 billion worth of investment that's gone elsewhere in the UK that could have been deployed into housing and social housing. We should not, as Scotland, have the level of homelessness and people living in completely inappropriate, poor housing that we have in this country. But that's because we've constrained the supply side.
Yeah.
And we might have done it with good intentions, but the problem is quite often is the case, the intention is well set, but actually the policy is poorly drafted and implemented and has those unintended consequences.
And sorry, I'm a housing board, but
that's all right.
Poor housing leads to poor health,
Yeah.
leads to poor productivity, leads to poor economic growth. You just can't separate housing from all the other things that we've talked about tonight.
It's all in there. Now, were any of you at our 25 years of devolution event back in March? Yeah, so well done for lasting 3 hours. We promised that this evening we would finish approximately on time. I think we're a minute over. But if anybody has a final question or a final point you want to make, or a question you want to ask any of these guys, here we go, down in the aisle here. Was there somebody else as well?
No, that's all.
Just down the aisle, yeah. And then on that note, we can wrap up. Hello there. What's your name?
Hi, my name's Frank.
Hi, Frank.
Could I just ask you to reflect on the format of what we've just done? Because it was Kate's remark about, here's a hustings and we're all being grown ups and talking to each other. And I think, as a politics geek for all my life, that day-to-day retail politics is just so boring now. It's scoring leaders' debates like their game shows. It's question time where you've got to say yes or no to a complex, nuanced question. We don't have this. Coming out of this tonight, and I know the 4 politicians reasonably well, watching them, but I think I've probably got a high regard for all of them, seeing them working together like that. Why can't we have this somewhere on the normal TV and radio?
Well, Frank.
Big clap, big clap.
Do I don't want to dive too deep in that, but if only you knew how hard we were trying to make this a thing on as you call it, normal television. And thank you. I honestly did not mean to end on such a wonderful compliment. But genuinely on that, I work in radio and it's difficult. One of the things that makes it difficult is when you get politicians like this on the radio, you are given 8 minutes at the most, by the way, 8 minutes at the most. And you feel like you have to go through however many things of the day to pin them on and to try to get an answer on, and it's just not constructive. And I think it's not about us, but one of the things we were determined to do when we started this was this, and to sit and chat and work things out and come to work our way towards solutions and answers and stuff. And it should not go unnoticed that because you listen and you show up, these politicians are willing to do it. So I urge you to keep doing that because this demonstrates to them that there's appetite for a different type of discussion. So thank you for being here, in fact, is the bottom line of all of that. Thank you. Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. This is a beautiful building. I hope we all take a minute to appreciate that. Thank you for taking your evening. Thank you for spending your money. Thank you for taking part. Thank you for subscribing and listening to the podcast. Genuinely, we really do mean that. If you think of anything on the way home, email us. The email address is hello@holyroodsources.com. We'll probably do a Q&A episode actually this week or next. So if you've got anything you want to follow up with us on, then please feel free. Sandy, thank you. Thank you to Scottish Financial Enterprise. Thank you to EY. And we will see you all again soon, I hope. Thank you very much for coming.